What if I told you that hidden within ancient stone tablets, buried beneath layers of dust and time, lies a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest struggles we still wrestle with today? Picture this, your fingers tracing the weathered grooves of a 4,000-year-old inscription. Each chisel marks a silent witness to the timeless dilemmas of justice, power, and morality. These aren't just relics of forgotten kings or dusty legal codes. They're conversations carved in stone, speaking across centuries to questions that haunt us even now. Why do we fight for fairness? How do we balance punishment with mercy? And what happens when the laws meant to protect us end up revealing our own contradictions? From the towering stele of Hammurabi in Mesopotamia to the solemn commandments etched on Sinai's slopes, these 25 laws aren't mere historical footnotes. They're a puzzle box of human nature, each rule a clue to understanding why societies rise and fall, and why we keep repeating the same moral battles. Take the infamous eye for an eye principle, often misunderstood as a call for vengeance. Dig deeper, and you'll find it was revolutionary for its time, a desperate attempt to limit violence, to replace endless blood feuds with measured justice. Yet here we are, millennia later, still debating where justice ends and cruelty begins. These stones don't just hold laws, they hold up a mirror to our own unresolved tensions. So why does this matter to you right now? Because every time we argue about fairness in courtrooms, debate ethics in classrooms, or even question the unwritten rules of our daily lives, we're stepping into the same river our ancestors waded through. The names and faces change, but the dilemmas remain. That's the power of these stone-carved edicts. They prove that humanity's greatest challenges aren't about finding perfect answers, but about asking better questions. Over the next minutes, we'll decode these ancient inscriptions together, revealing how their wisdom and their warnings echo in our modern world. This isn't just a history lesson. It's an excavation of the human soul, ready to dig deeper. The Code of Hammurabi stands as one of humanity's first attempts to codify justice, a towering black stone etched with 282 laws, each a window into the fears and aspirations of ancient Mesopotamia. At its core lies the infamous principle we still whisper today: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But here's what most people miss: this wasn't just about revenge. It was a radical restraint. Before Hammurabi, justice was often a wildfire, with minor disputes sparking generational blood feuds. If someone harmed your family, you might wipe out their entire village in return. The code's brutal symmetry was actually a desperate compromise, a way to say, this far, no further. Yet the contradictions in this system are as striking as its innovations. Consider Law 196. If a builder's shoddy work causes a house to collapse and kill the owner's son, the builder's own son must be put to death. To modern ears, that sounds monstrous, punishing an innocent child for a parent's mistake. But in its time, it reflected a grim logic: accountability through shared vulnerability. The code assumed people would only take care if their own survival was tied to their actions. It's a chilling reminder of how easily systems meant to protect can instead entrench cruelty. Fast forward 3,000 years, and you'll find echoes of this dilemma in every courtroom. When a judge sentences someone, are they restoring balance or continuing a cycle? Even our modern justice systems wrestle with Hammurabi's shadow. Take the death penalty. Supporters argue it's the ultimate, measure for measure, while opponents see it as legalized vengeance. The code forces us to ask, can fairness ever be calculated like math? Or does true justice require something beyond equivalence? Perhaps the most surprising lesson Hammurabi offers isn't about law at all, but about human nature. His stele famously shows the king receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god, a divine endorsement meant to make them unquestionable. Yet buried in the text is Law 5, where a judge who issues a wrongful verdict must pay 12 times the fine and lose his position. Even then, rulers knew no system is perfect. They understood the danger of power without accountability, a warning that resonates in every era. The real legacy of an eye for an eye isn't in the violence it permitted, but in the humanity it couldn't suppress. The commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," echoes through history as one of humanity's most enduring moral boundaries, a stark line drawn in the sand of human behavior. But like all great laws, its simplicity masks a profound complexity. Carved into stone on Mount Sinai, this directive wasn't just a rule, it was a revolution. In a world where power often meant the right to take life on a whim, the idea that every person's existence carried inherent sacredness was radical. Yet from the moment those words were etched, they sparked a paradox we've never resolved. If killing is an absolute wrong, why do societies still condone it in war, self-defense, or justice? Dig into the original Hebrew text, and you'll find the word ratzach often translated as murder rather than kill. This subtle distinction matters. It suggests the commandment targets unlawful, intentional killing, not all acts of taking life. Ancient Jewish scholars debated its boundaries endlessly. Was it permissible to kill in defense of one's home? What about executing a convicted murderer? These weren't academic questions. They were attempts to reconcile divine ideals with the messy reality of survival. Fast forward to medieval Europe, and Christian theologians like Thomas Aquinas would argue for just war theory, claiming certain killings could be morally justified if they served greater justice. Even the strictest moral codes bend under the weight of human circumstance. What's startling is how this single commandment rippled across cultures far beyond its biblical origins. Buddhist teachings enshrine ahimsa, or non-violence, as a core virtue. Hindu scripture warns that harming others brings spiritual corruption. Secular legal systems, from ancient Rome to modern democracies, all grapple with defining when taking a life transitions from crime to necessity. The tension is universal. We crave moral absolutes, but life demands nuance. Consider the soldier who kills to protect civilians, or the surgeon whose mistake ends a patient's life. Both involve the irreversible, yet we judge them worlds apart. Perhaps the most revealing test of this commandment lies in its exceptions. Every culture that reveres "thou shalt not kill" has also carved out scenarios where it's permitted, whether through capital punishment, warfare, or self-defense. This isn't hypocrisy, it's a testament to the law's impossible demand. Absolute non-violence remains an aspirational North Star, while humanity navigates the shadows below. The commandment's power isn't in resolving our dilemmas, but in forcing us to confront them. Every time a jury debates a murder charge or a nation justifies going to war, they're wrestling with the same unanswerable question sign I posed millennia ago. Where does the sanctity of life end and the right to take it begin? Embedded in this ancient law is a mirror for our modern souls. It shows us that the deepest moral codes aren't just rules to follow, they're conversations to continue. The commandment against killing doesn't give us easy answers. It gives us a lifelong challenge to weigh every life's worth, even when the scales tremble in our hands. Imagine living in a world where stealing an apple could cost you your life, where the scales of justice tipped so far toward punishment that even minor offenses carried unbearable consequences. This was the reality under Draco, the Athenian lawmaker whose name became synonymous with extreme severity. In the 7th century before the Common Era, Athens stood at a crossroads. Crime and social unrest threatened to tear the city apart, and Draco responded with a legal code so harsh, his legacy still lingers in the word draconian. But beneath the surface of these brutal laws lies a deeper question. When does the pursuit of order become oppression? Draco's approach was shockingly simple: uniformity through terror. His laws prescribed death not just for murder, but for offenses as trivial as idleness or petty theft. Ancient historians like Plutarch noted that when asked why death was the penalty for most crimes, Draco reportedly replied, "The lesser ones deserve it, and for the greater, I have no worse punishment." At first glance, this seems like pure tyranny, yet context matters. Before Draco, Athens had no written legal code. Justice was arbitrary, often favoring the powerful over the weak. By codifying punishments, however severe, Draco introduced a radical idea: equality under the law. Even aristocrats could now face consequences, but here's the paradox. While Draco's laws aimed to create stability, they may have deepened the very chaos they sought to cure. Surviving accounts suggest Athenians grew weary of living under constant threat of execution for minor missteps. The playwright Aristophanes later mocked the system, joking that Draco's laws were written not in ink but in blood. Within decades, the reforms of Solon would soften these penalties, proving that fear alone couldn't sustain a society. The echoes of this ancient dilemma resonate in modern debates about punishment. Consider mandatory minimum sentencing laws or 3 strikes policies that impose life terms for repeat offenders, even non-violent ones. Supporters argue they deter crime, just as Draco intended. Critics see them as disproportionately harsh, crushing lives instead of rehabilitating them. The tension is timeless. How do we balance the need for safety with respect for human dignity? Draco's most enduring lesson isn't about the effectiveness of fear, it's about the unintended consequences of absolutism. His laws remind us that when justice becomes rigid, it often breaks the very people it's meant to protect. The stones bearing his code may have crumbled, but the question they posed remains: can a society truly flourish when its laws leave no room for mercy? The 12 Tables of Rome stand as a revolutionary milestone, not for their content alone, but for the radical idea they proclaimed, that the law should apply equally to every citizen. Carved into bronze in the 5th century before the Common Era, these 12 tablets weren't just a legal code, they were a declaration. For the first time in Rome's history, the rules governing society weren't whispered in the halls of the elite, they stood in the forum for all to see. Patrician and plebeian alike could point to the same words, demanding equal treatment. Yet behind this noble ideal lurked a far messier truth. The law might have been visible to all, but its protections weren't equally within reach. Take the stark contrast between Tables 3 and 4. One guaranteed debtors 30 days to repay what they owed before facing consequences. Another allowed creditors to chain defaulters or even sell them into slavery. On the surface, this seems fair, clear rules for all. But who bore the brunt of these laws? The plebeians, Rome's working class, who often borrowed just to survive poor harvests. Meanwhile, the patricians, with their inherited wealth, rarely faced the lash of debt bondage. The tables didn't create equality. They revealed how easily laws can be blind to the inequalities they're built upon. The tension between principle and practice echoes through the ages. Consider Table 8, which punished false testimony by throwing the liar from the Tarpeian rock, a death sentence. Harsh as it sounds, this was progress. Before the 12 Tables, legal disputes often boiled down to whose family had more influence. Now, even the powerful could face consequences for lying under oath. But here's the catch: the law only protected those who could access the courts in the first place. For enslaved people or non-citizens, justice remained out of reach. Modern parallels abound. Today's legal systems proudly declare equal justice under law, yet disparities persist. Wealthy defendants hire elite attorneys, while others rely on overburdened public defenders. Laws banning voter discrimination exist, but gerrymandering can dilute minority voices. Like Rome, we've enshrined equality in theory while wrestling with it in practice. The 12 Tables remind us that writing fairness into stone is just the first step. The harder work is ensuring those words don't become hollow promises. Perhaps the most revealing moment came decades after the tables were erected. As Rome expanded, conquering neighboring peoples, a question arose: should these conquered groups enjoy the same legal protections? The answer was a careful compromise, the concept of ius gentium, or law of nations, which granted certain rights to non-citizens. It wasn't full equality, but it acknowledged that justice couldn't stop at the city gates. In that tension between exclusion and inclusion, we see the same debates that shape immigration policy and human rights today. The legacy of the 12 Tables isn't that they achieved perfect fairness. No legal system ever has. Their power lies in the standard they set, that laws must be public, knowable, and applied without favor. Every time a protester demands transparency or a reformer fights to close loopholes that benefit the privileged, they're walking the path Rome's plebeians first carved. The tables taught us that equality before the law isn't a destination, but a relentless pursuit, one that demands we keep chiseling away at the barriers between principle and practice. History remembers Emperor Ashoka as the ruler who traded bloodshed for benevolence, a conqueror who carved his regrets into stone. After the brutal Kalinga War left hundreds of thousands dead, Ashoka's edicts didn't celebrate victory, they mourned it. Scattered across the Indian subcontinent, these pillars and rock faces bore messages unseen in the ancient world. Apologies for suffering, calls for religious tolerance, even directives to plant shade trees for travelers. In a landscape dominated by laws threatening death for theft or disobedience, Ashoka's words stood apart. His was a radical experiment. Could a kingdom be ruled not by fear but by conscience? The third edict holds a particularly striking confession. The beloved of the gods considers victory by righteousness the foremost victory. This from a man who'd once expanded his empire through sheer military might. Ashoka didn't just preach non-violence, he institutionalized it, banning animal sacrifices, establishing hospitals for humans and beasts alike, and sending diplomats instead of soldiers to neighboring lands. Yet the tension in his reign is palpable. However compassionate his laws, they still flowed from imperial authority. When he urged subjects to respect elders or practice charity, these weren't suggestions. They were commands etched in granite by a sovereign's hand. Modern parallels emerge in societies that blend welfare with control. Scandinavia's progressive policies coexist with high tax rates and strict social contracts. Bhutan measures national success through gross national happiness while maintaining monarchy. Ashoka's dilemma persists. Can a state enforce kindness without undermining the very freedom that makes compassion meaningful? His edicts on animal welfare, for instance, weren't optional. Breaking them risked royal displeasure. This paradox haunts every well-intentioned government program. How do we nurture goodness without mandating it? What makes Ashoka's legacy so enduring isn't just his ideals, but his honesty about failing them. The seventh pillar edict admits that despite his reforms, the people are not progressing as desired in morality. Here was a ruler acknowledging the limits of law to transform hearts. Centuries before philosophers debated state overreach, Ashoka grappled with it firsthand. His stones reveal a man wrestling with power's double edge, the way it can uplift lives just as easily as it can dictate them. the edict's true revolution lies in their vulnerability. While Hammurabi's code presented itself as divine and unchangeable, Ashoka's writings feel human, flawed, evolving, even self-doubting. One rock inscription famously urges future rulers to publicly correct his mistakes if needed. This humility transforms stone into something startlingly alive. It asks us whether our own systems could benefit from such transparency, from laws that admit they might be wrong, rather than pretending to be perfect. Across 2 millennia, Ashoka's chisel marks whisper a challenge. Can justice exist without mercy? Can power exist without apology? 6 centuries after Rome's 12 tables, another legal revolution was brewing, this one not carved in stone, but painstakingly copied onto parchment. Emperor Justinian's ambition wasn't just to rule an empire, it was to tame the chaotic sprawl of centuries of Roman law into a single, coherent system. The result, a legal code so meticulously organized that its shadow stretches across courtrooms from Paris to Buenos Aires today. But beneath its polished surface lies a question that still divides scholars. Was this monumental work an act of preservation, or a subtle rewriting of history to serve those in power? The scope of Justinian's project was staggering. His team of jurists, led by the brilliant Tribonian, sifted through over 1,600 scrolls of Roman legal opinions spanning 1,000 years. They didn't just compile, they edited, cutting contradictions and smoothing inconsistencies to create 50 volumes of distilled legal wisdom. At first glance, this seems like a gift to posterity. Imagine trying to navigate modern law without standardized codes, where every judge could interpret centuries of conflicting rulings differently. The Justinian Code brought order to this chaos, creating what scholars call the corpus juris civilis, the body of civil law. Yet every act of selection is also an act of exclusion. As the scribes worked, certain old laws mysteriously disappeared, particularly those that granted women greater property rights under earlier emperors. Other changes quietly strengthened imperial authority, like the new principle that what pleases the prince has the force of law. Historians debate whether this was pragmatic streamlining or deliberate erasure. The code preserved Rome's legal genius while subtly reshaping it into a tool for centralized control, a tension we see whenever governments reform legal systems today. The code's most enduring legacy lies in its structure. Justinian's team didn't just collect laws, they organized them by principle, creating categories like persons, property, and obligations that still form the skeleton of modern legal education. This systematic approach allowed the code to outlast Byzantium itself. When medieval scholars rediscovered it centuries later, its logical framework became the foundation for European legal traditions. Napoleon's Civil Code, the basis for laws across Latin America and Louisiana, directly mirrors Justinian's organizational genius, but here's the paradox. The same code that championed principles like innocent until proven guilty also enshrined brutal inequalities. Enslaved people remained property under its provisions, and women needed male guardians for legal transactions. This duality forces us to ask, can a legal system be both groundbreaking and deeply flawed? The Justinian Code suggests the answer is yes, that progress often comes in half measures, with each advance shadowed by stubborn injustices. Perhaps the most revealing lesson from Justinian's project isn't in the laws themselves, but in their afterlife. As the Byzantine Empire crumbled, the code was nearly lost until scholars in places like Bologna began piecing together surviving fragments. Their work sparked a legal renaissance that shaped modern justice. This cycle of loss and rediscovery mirrors how legal traditions evolve, not in straight lines but through fits, starts, and chance survivals. The code reminds us that legal systems aren't immutable truths. but human creations always balancing the weight of tradition against the need to adapt. When modern lawmakers debate updating antiquated statutes or reconciling conflicting precedents, they're walking in Justinian's footsteps. The tension he faced between preserving legal heritage and reshaping it for new times has never been resolved. His code stands as both a monument to order and a cautionary tale that even the fairest systems carry the fingerprints of their creators' biases. The parchment may have yellowed, but the dilemma remains fresh: how to honor the past without being imprisoned by it. The meadow at Runnymede in 1215 seemed an unlikely stage for revolution, just a patch of damp grass by the Thames where a frustrated group of barons cornered a reluctant king. Yet the document sealed there, the Magna Carta, would echo through centuries as the first blunt instrument to chip away at the divine right of kings. Its most famous clause, that no free man could be imprisoned or stripped of his rights without lawful judgment, wasn't just a legal technicality. It was a declaration that power, no matter how exalted, had limits. But here's what often gets glossed over in the triumphant retellings. King John renounced the charter within weeks, and the liberties it promised would remain theoretical for generations. The Magna Carta's true power wasn't in its immediate enforcement, but in the precedent it set that authority could be questioned, and that even rulers weren't above the law. Look closer at the text, and you'll find contradictions as revealing as its ideals. While Clause 39 promised due process, the Charter also reinforced serfdom, leaving the majority of England's population without its protections. The barons weren't democratic reformers. They were powerful men fighting to curb a king who threatened their privileges. Yet in their self-interest, they accidentally forged a tool others would later wield for broader justice. Centuries later, figures like Thomas Jefferson would lift phrases almost verbatim from the Magna Carta when drafting foundational texts like the Declaration of Independence. The document's genius lies in how its words outgrew their origins, becoming a blueprint for freedoms its authors never envisioned. Modern parallels emerge in every constitutional crisis. When courts overturn executive orders or legislatures impeach leaders, they're invoking the same principle first forced upon King John, that no one gets unchecked power. But the Magna Carta also warns of the gap between principle and practice. For all its lofty language, the Charter failed to prevent John's successors from ignoring it when convenient. Like today's constitutions, its strength depended on collective will to enforce it. The parchment didn't create liberty, it gave people a text to point to when demanding it. Perhaps the most telling moment came 4 centuries after Runnymede, when an English judge named Edward Coke resurrected the long-neglected charter to challenge King James I's absolutism. Dusting off its clauses, he argued they proved monarchs couldn't invent new crimes or bypass courts. This wasn't just legal scholarship, it was alchemy, transforming an old feudal contract into a shield against tyranny. The Magna Carta reminds us that laws alone can't guarantee freedom. They need interpreters brave enough to give them teeth. Today, as governments debate surveillance, executive privilege, and states of emergency, we're still drawing lines in the same sand where John's barons stood. The Magna Carta's legacy isn't a checklist of achieved liberties, but a perpetual challenge to hold power accountable, even when, especially when, it insists it's beyond questioning. The ink may have faded, but the lesson remains sharp as ever. No one gets to write their own rules, not even a king. Napoleon's conquests reshaped Europe with cannon fire and cavalry charges, but his most enduring weapon wasn't forged from steel. The Napoleonic Code, implemented in 1804, didn't just reorganize French law. It became a blueprint for modernity, spreading across continents like legal wildfire. For the first time, an entire nation's laws were condensed into a single, clear document written not in Latin for scholars, but in plain French for every citizen to understand. Clarity was revolutionary. No longer would justice depend on memorizing centuries of contradictory rulings or deciphering archaic phrases. The code promised something radical, that the law could be known, predictable, and in theory applied equally to all. Yet beneath this veneer of progress lurked a quiet tension. Can uniformity ever come without sacrifice? Take inheritance laws as a case study. Before Napoleon, regions like Provence and Brittany followed distinct customs, some splitting property equally among heirs, others favoring eldest sons. The code erased these variations overnight, imposing equal division across France. To reformers, this was fairness incarnate, breaking aristocratic traditions that concentrated wealth. But to families in rural Alsace or the Basque Country, it felt like an assault on their identity. The law's very strength, its refusal to make exceptions, became its most painful edge. Historians still debate whether this cultural leveling was the price of national unity or the arrogance of centralized power. The code's global influence reveals even deeper ironies. As Napoleon's armies marched across Europe, they carried these laws like ideological seeds, planting them in places as diverse as Egypt, Poland, and Louisiana. After his fall, newly independent nations from Haiti to Argentina kept the code's framework, attracted by its logical structure. Even today, over 40 legal systems trace their roots to this document. Yet in many cases, the very clarity that made the code appealing also made it a tool of control. Colonial administrators loved its efficiency, using standardized laws to govern disparate peoples from Senegal to Cambodia. The same principles meant to liberate citizens from arbitrary rule could, in foreign hands, become instruments of domination. Napoleon's vision of legal purity collided most starkly with gender equality. The code famously declared women minors for life, requiring male approval for everything from opening a bank account to publishing a book. This wasn't an oversight, it was deliberate, reversing more progressive measures from the French Revolution. Ironically, the same document that championed meritocracy over aristocracy entrenched new hierarchies. The contradiction haunts every legal reform. Who gets left behind when systems prioritize order over nuance? Modern echoes of this dilemma appear whenever standardization clashes with diversity. The European Union's push for uniform regulations across 27 nations, or tech platforms imposing global content rules on local cultures, all grapple with Napoleon's legacy. The code forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the march toward clarity and efficiency often tramples the very differences that make societies vibrant. Its greatest lesson isn't in its articles, but in its warning that no law, no matter how brilliantly crafted, can be one size fits all. What survives today isn't just the code's text, but the tension it embodies. As civil codes from Quebec to Cambodia still borrow its structure, they've also adapted its provisions to reflect evolving values, granting women equal rights, recognizing unwritten indigenous customs. The Napoleonic Code endures not as a frozen monument, but as a living argument that laws must balance the clarity of principles with the complexity of human lives. 2 centuries later, its pages still whisper a challenge to build systems that are fair without being rigid, uniform without being blind. The Geneva Conventions stand as humanity's most ambitious attempt to impose order on chaos, to carve rules into the bedrock of war itself. Born from the horrors of World War II, these treaties represent a collective gasp of conscience. Even here, in the darkest corners of conflict, we must draw lines. Hospitals and medics are off limits. Prisoners deserve humane treatment. Civilians are never targets. On paper, it's a covenant of mercy. but step onto any modern battlefield, and the dissonance hits like artillery fire. Drone strikes level apartment blocks. Soldiers torture detainees in shadowy prisons. The very conventions designed to humanize war often feel like a whisper drowned out by the roar of grenades. This isn't just about broken rules, it's about the paradox at war's core. How can laws which rely on mutual agreement govern an act defined by the total rejection of agreement? The conventions work beautifully when both sides play by the rules, but when one party sees advantage in brutality, like the use of human shields or chemical weapons, the system crumbles. International courts can issue indictments, yet warlords still sleep soundly in palaces. The problem isn't just enforcement, it's the unsettling truth that war, by its nature, rewards those who break conventions first. Yet dismissing these laws as naive would miss their quiet power. Before Geneva, armies plundered cities without consequence. Prisoners were routinely executed. The conventions didn't eliminate atrocities, but they created something revolutionary: accountability. When a Syrian photographer smuggles out images of bombed hospitals, or when a soldier leaks evidence of war crimes, they're invoking Geneva's legacy. These laws give victims a language to name their suffering, and the world a standard to demand better. The conventions also expose a deeper tension in how we perceive violence. Notice how society condemns an army that targets civilians but celebrates a general whose tactics win battles. We want war to have limits, yet we mythologize those who break them for victory. This hypocrisy isn't new. Sun Tzu wrote of sparing surrendering enemies 2,000 years ago, yet his advice was strategic, not moral, mercy as a tool to weaken resistance. Geneva's true challenge isn't to warlords but to the rest of us. Do we really want wars fought fairly, or do we just want to win? Perhaps the most revealing test of these laws lies in their exceptions. The conventions permit military necessity, a loophole wide enough to drive a tank through. Bomb a school, just claim it housed enemy combatants. This isn't a flaw in the text, it's a mirror. The conventions reflect our own conflicted morality, where we condemn cruelty but accept it when dressed in uniform. Every drone operator who justifies collateral damage, every politician who calls torture enhanced interrogation, they're wrestling with Geneva's unanswerable question: can violence ever be civilized? The answer may lie not in the treaties themselves, but in how they're reclaimed. When Ukrainian volunteers document Russian atrocities using Geneva's framework, or when veterans testify about wartime trauma, they're not just invoking laws, they're asserting that war doesn't erase humanity. The conventions endure not because they've ended war's horrors, but because they refuse to let us look away. Their power isn't in controlling violence, but in ensuring it's never seen as normal. In that refusal to let brutality go unnamed lies the fragile hope that one day, the laws of war might render war itself unlawful. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights should have been a turning point, a moment when the world, still trembling from the horrors of World War II, finally agreed on the irreducible dignity of every person. Drafted in 1948, its 30 articles read like poetry: the right to life, to education, to freedom from torture, no slavery, no arbitrary arrest. No discrimination. These weren't just legal principles, they were promises etched into the conscience of humanity. Yet here's the bitter irony. The same year this document was adopted, colonial powers still ruled over hundreds of millions without their consent. Apartheid was hardening in South Africa. Jim Crow laws still gripped the American South. The Declaration's brilliance lies not in its perfection, but in its audacity. It dared to name a world that didn't exist, hoping reality might one day catch up. 75 years later, that gap between aspiration and actuality remains stark. Consider Article 5's prohibition of torture, a clear, unequivocal line. Yet from Syria's prisons to CIA black sites, states continue to violate it with impunity. Or Article 23's guarantee of fair pay, while garment workers in Bangladesh stitch fast fashion for pennies. The Declaration isn't weak, it's trapped in a paradox. Its power comes from being universal, applicable to all nations. But that very universality means no one is truly bound to enforce it. Unlike treaties with teeth like the Geneva Conventions, the Declaration is aspirational, a moral compass without a mechanism to point the way. What makes this document extraordinary isn't its successes, but how its failures reveal systemic truths. When Saudi Arabia, a nation where women couldn't drive until 2017, signed the Declaration, they did so with a caveat: compliance only, within the bounds of Islamic law. Similar reservations came from communist states, apartheid regimes, and colonial powers. Everyone agreed on the principles, as long as they didn't have to apply them at home. This hypocrisy isn't a bug in the system, it's the system. Human rights declarations flourish precisely because they demand everything and thus, in practice, require nothing. Yet dismissing the Declaration as mere symbolism misses its subterranean power. Like a seed cracking concrete, its words have grown in unexpected places. South African activists cited it during apartheid trials. Argentine mothers held its pages aloft while searching for their disappeared children. China's AI Weiwei turned Article 19 on free expression into art installations censored by the very government that ratified it. The Declaration's genius is its mutability. It becomes what oppressed peoples need it to be: a shield, a mirror, a crowbar prying open the doors of injustice. The real tension lies in who gets to define these rights. The Declaration's drafters were mostly Western men. 11 out of 18 members came from Europe or North America. Their vision reflected Enlightenment ideals of individual liberty, often clashing with communal values in Africa, Asia, or indigenous cultures. When Botswana's High Court decriminalized homosexuality in 2019, citing the Declaration, traditional leaders protested what they saw as cultural imperialism. This isn't just about resistance to progress. It's about whether rights can ever be truly universal if their definitions flow from one dominant worldview. Perhaps the Declaration's most lasting lesson is that rights aren't given, they're taken. Every freedom we now take for granted, women voting, interracial marriage, disability accommodations, began as someone's impossible demand. The document doesn't create justice, it legitimizes the struggle for it. When protesters in Tehran chant for gender equality or Hong Kong students wave 5 demands banners, they're not waiting for the UN to act. They're wielding the Declaration's words as weapons, turning lofty ideals into lived reality. The gap between its promises and our world isn't a failure, it's the battleground where the future is fought. In the end, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is less a law than a prophecy, one we're still laboring to fulfill. Its stones aren't in some grand monument, but in the hands of those who refuse to accept that hunger, oppression, or silence are just the way things are. The Declaration matters not because it changed the world, but because it gave us the language to keep trying. Long before Hammurabi raised his stone or Moses descended Sinai, a Sumerian king etched justice into clay and rewrote humanity's relationship with order. The Code of Ernamu, pressed into damp tablets around 2100 years before the Common Era, doesn't just hold the title of oldest written laws, it reveals a seismic shift in how societies conceive fairness. Unlike later codes drenched in blood penalties, Ernamu's laws favored fines over fatalities. Break someone's bone, pay 60 silver shekels, damage a neighbor's property. Compensation, not corporal punishment. At first glance, this seems astonishingly modern, a system prioritizing repair over retribution. But dig deeper, and you'll find a tension as old as civilization itself. Is restitution truly justice, or just a more sophisticated leash? The brilliance of Ernamu lies in its subtle psychology. By replacing tribal vengeance with standardized payments, it didn't just punish, it redirected human impulses. Imagine two farmers in ancient one's ox gores the other's son. Under older customs, this might spark a generational feud. Ernamu's solution: the ox's owner pays 40 shekels, and the community moves forward. This wasn't just about mercy, it was social engineering. Stability required channeling rage into transactions, turning hot-blooded retaliation into cold, calculated exchanges. The Code's true innovation wasn't its kindness, it was realizing that prosperous cities couldn't thrive amid constant bloodshed. Yet the shadows in this system are just as revealing. While Ernamu's laws seem progressive compared to Draco's death penalties or Hammurabi's brutal symmetry, they weren't egalitarian. Fines varied wildly by victim status. Harming a noble cost 10 times more than injuring a slave. The Code also institutionalized class divides, with separate penalties for commoners versus elites. Here lies the uncomfortable truth. Even the fairest-seeming ancient systems reinforced hierarchies. Restitution only worked if you could pay, and if your life was valued enough to warrant compensation in the first place. Modern parallels abound in today's justice systems. Scandinavian countries emphasize rehabilitation over punishment, favoring therapy and community service over prison time. Meanwhile, plea bargains in many legal systems allow offenders to pay their way out through fines, a practice that critics argue favors the wealthy. Ernamu's legacy forces us to ask, when does restitution become privilege? Can a system truly be just if accountability depends on your bank account? Perhaps the most striking lesson from these 4,000-year-old tablets isn't about law at all, it's about language. Ernamu's code was written in Sumerian cuneiform, a script so complex that only scribes could read it. The very laws meant to standardize justice were inaccessible to most people they governed. This paradox echoes in modern legal systems drowning in jargon, where understanding your rights often requires expensive experts. The Code reminds us that transparency is as vital as the rules themselves, that justice obscured is justice denied. What endures isn't just Ernamu's specific fines or clauses, but the foundational idea they planted. That order requires more than force. By valuing balance over brutality, these ancient laws laid the groundwork for concepts we still wrestle with: restorative justice, proportional punishment, even victim compensation funds. Their clay may have crumbled, but the question they posed remains fresh as ever. Can we design systems that heal harm without replicating the very inequalities that caused it? The answer, it seems, is still being written. The Laws of Manu sit at the crossroads of sacred duty and systemic oppression, a 3,000-year-old Hindu text that didn't just describe society, but designed it. Imagine a world where your birth determines not just your occupation, but your spiritual worth, your marriage prospects, even the food you're permitted to eat. This wasn't metaphor, it was daily life under Manu's code, where the 4 Varnas: Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras were said to spring from the very body of the cosmic being. Priests emerged from the mouth, warriors from the arms, merchants from the thighs, laborers from the feet. On the surface, this was cosmology, not cruelty, a divine blueprint for harmony. But etched between its verses lies a haunting question: when does order become bondage? What's striking isn't just the hierarchy, but how Manu wove morality into its fabric. A Brahmin who failed to study the Vedas could be reborn as a crow, while a Shudra who dared to recite scripture risked having molten lead poured into their ears. Punishments weren't merely practical, they were theological, reinforcing the idea that social roles reflected cosmic balance. Yet for all its rigidity, the system offered something modern societies still crave: clarity. Every individual knew their place, their duties, their path to spiritual merit. In an uncertain world, Manu's laws provided a map, even if it was one many couldn't escape. The tension between stability and freedom pulses through modern debates like a heartbeat. When France bans religious symbols in schools or Japan resists immigration to preserve cultural homogeneity, they're wrestling with Manu's legacy. His code forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that societies often trade equality for cohesion, mistaking tradition for truth. India's own constitution outlawed caste discrimination in 1950, yet the shadows of Varna linger in rural villages and urban boardrooms alike. Like a stubborn root system, these ancient categories still shape where people live, who they marry, even how they're treated in hospitals. But here's what's easily missed: Manu's laws weren't static. Over centuries, commentators reinterpreted them, sometimes softening edges, other times hardening divisions. The text itself contains contradictions, with verses praising Shudras who serve with devotion alongside others calling them unworthy of rights. This fluidity reveals a paradox. Even the most rigid systems evolve when pressed. Today's Dalit activists, descendants of those once labeled untouchable, reclaim Manu's framework by flipping its logic. If birth determines destiny, they argue, then their oppression births a moral duty to dismantle the system itself. The real lesson of Manu's code lies not in its prescriptions, but in its power to shape reality. Like Hammurabi's steel or Justinian's parchments, these laws didn't just reflect society, they molded it generation after generation. When we debate affirmative action, inherited wealth, or nepotism in Hollywood dynasties, we're grappling with the same questions. How much should ancestry determine opportunity? Can meritocracy exist when the starting lines are centuries apart? Manu's world may seem distant, but its echoes haunt every conversation about who deserves what and why. Perhaps the most revealing test of these ancient laws is how they're remembered. For some, they're sacred wisdom; for others, a blueprint for injustice. This duality mirrors the tension in all great legal traditions between the order they create and the freedoms they constrain. The laws of Manu challenge us to ask not just what rules we live by, but who gets to write them and who pays the price when those rules harden into fate. The Quran's legal principles don't just dictate punishments or contracts, they weave morality into the very fabric of daily life, transforming acts as mundane as borrowing money or inheriting land into tests of spiritual integrity. Take the prohibition against riba, often translated as usury. On the surface, it forbids exploitative interest rates, but dig deeper, and you'll find a radical economic vision. Wealth shouldn't grow passively while others struggle. Yet here's the tension. Modern Islamic banks now craft Sharia-compliant financial products that mimic conventional loans with creative semantics. Is this innovation or evasion? The struggle to apply 7th century principles to 21st century markets reveals a universal dilemma. How do divine commands breathe in an ever-changing world? Across the Muslim world, this question sparks fiery debates. In Malaysia, female judges preside over Sharia courts, interpreting texts to expand women's rights in divorce cases. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia only recently lifted its ban on women driving, a restriction with no direct Quranic basis, but rooted in conservative clerical rulings. These disparities aren't accidents. They reflect Islam's decentralized tradition, where interpretation ijtihad has always been a living conversation. The Quran itself acknowledges context, with verses revealed gradually to address specific community crises. Early jurists understood this dynamism. The famed scholar al-Shafi'i famously revised his legal theories after moving from Baghdad to Cairo, recognizing that desert precedents didn't always fit a riverine society. Yet flexibility has its limits. When Tunisia abolished polygamy in 1956, citing Quranic verses about equitable treatment of wives impossible, they argued, in practice, traditionalists cried heresy. Similar clashes erupt over issues like LGBTQ rights or artificial intelligence, domains the Quran never explicitly addressed. Reformers point to the Maqasid al-Sharia, Islam's higher objectives of justice and welfare, to justify new readings. Traditionalists counter that divine law isn't a buffet where humans pick what suits them. Caught in the middle are ordinary believers, navigating smartphones and satellite dishes while seeking guidance from texts revealed in an age of camel caravans. The most revealing test of Quranic adaptability lies in criminal law. The much-debated hudud punishments like flogging or stoning are derived from specific verses but require near-impossible standards of evidence. 4 eyewitnesses to adultery, for instance. Some Muslim-majority countries enforce them rigidly. Others, like Morocco, have effectively abandoned them. Scholars note that the Prophet Muhammad himself rarely applied hudud, preferring repentance over punishment. This disparity between text and practice forces a hard question. Are these laws meant to be enacted literally, or are they symbolic reminders of sin's gravity? The answer often depends less on theology than on politics, leaders manipulating religious rhetoric to consolidate power. What makes Quranic law unique isn't its antiquity, but its dual nature as both immutable and interpretive. Unlike Roman or common law, it claims divine authorship, yet its human interpreters disagree wildly. A teenage girl in Jakarta might wear hijab because her grandmother never did, reclaiming modesty as feminist empowerment. A cleric in Qatar might cite the same verses to justify gender segregation. This isn't contradiction, it's the messy reality of any living tradition. The Quran's enduring power lies not in providing easy answers, but in compelling each generation to ask, what does justice demand here and now? The ink on its pages may be dry, but the conversation it sparks is alive with possibility. While European monarchs consolidated power through divine right and conquest, an entirely different vision of governance was flourishing in North America's woodlands. The Haudenosaunee, known to many as the Iroquois Confederacy, had crafted a constitution so revolutionary it would one day inspire Benjamin Franklin and shape the U.S. government's foundations. But here's what often gets overlooked. The Great Law of Peace wasn't just a political system. It was a spiritual covenant woven from principles of consensus, sustainability, and collective well-being that turned European notions of authority upside down. Picture this: 5 warring nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, laying down their weapons beneath the tree of peace, choosing dialogue over dominance. Their solution: a government where no decision could advance without unanimous agreement, where leaders were chosen by clan mothers, and where 7 generations yet unborn had a voice in every deliberation. The brilliance of this system lay in its refusal to equate strength with hierarchy. Unlike European models where kings ruled by decree, Haudenosaunee leaders couldn't impose their will, they had to persuade. Disputes required endless discussion until every dissenting voice was heard and reconciled. This wasn't inefficiency, it was institutionalized empathy. When colonial emissaries like Franklin witnessed these practices in the 1740s, they were stunned. How could a society function without coercive power? Yet the Confederacy had thrived for centuries, its stability rooted in a radical idea that true authority flows from collective consent, not force. Sustainability wasn't just an environmental principle here, it was governance incarnate. The famous seventh-generation rule forced leaders to weigh every decision against its impact 2 centuries into the future. Compare this to European rulers waging dynastic wars that ravaged landscapes for short-term glory. While London and Paris built empires on extraction, the Haudenosaunee managed forests as a shared trust, rotating hunting grounds to prevent depletion. Their laws didn't just regulate behavior, they encoded reverence for the web of life, a concept modern policymakers now scramble to emulate as climate change accelerates. The clash of worldviews couldn't have been starker. When European settlers arrived with their top-down legal systems, they dismissed indigenous governance as primitive, failing to grasp its sophistication. Yet traces of the Great Law seeped into colonial consciousness. The Albany Plan of Union in 1754, an early blueprint for American unity, borrowed directly from Iroquois federalism. Later, the U.S. Constitution's balance of powers and federal structure echoed the Confederacy's model, though conspicuously omitting its egalitarian elements like women's political roles. This selective adoption reveals a painful irony. A nation founded on consent of the governed would take 2 more centuries to extend voting rights to women and minorities, rights the Haudenosaunee had honored since time immemorial. Today, as democracies worldwide grapple with polarization, the Great Law's legacy offers provocative alternatives. New Zealand's Wanganui River recently gained legal personhood, a concept mirroring indigenous views of nature as kin rather than property. Nordic consensus-based politics and restorative justice programs all carry faint echoes of that longhouse diplomacy, but the most profound lesson lies in the Confederacy's original purpose, not to control people but to sustain life. In an age of short-term electoral cycles and billionaire lobbying, that vision feels less like ancient wisdom than an urgent survival manual. The stones of this law weren't carved in granite, but planted as living roots, and they still grip the earth, waiting for us to listen. The witch trials didn't begin with flames or nooses, they started with ink and parchment. When Europe's ruling elites stamped their seals onto laws condemning witchcraft, they weren't just banning magic, they were turning fear into a legal weapon. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens of thousands, mostly women, were hanged, drowned, or burned under statutes like the Holy Roman Empire's Malleus Maleficarum or England's Witchcraft Act. But here's what's chilling: these weren't rogue mob actions. They were state-sanctioned, meticulously documented purges, where courtroom procedure masked collective hysteria. The real horror lies not in the superstition, but in how easily law can be perverted to sanctify cruelty. Consider the logic loop that fueled these trials. Laws defined witchcraft as an invisible crime, no evidence required beyond accusations. Confessions, often extracted through torture, became the ultimate proof of guilt. And who bore the brunt? Midwives with knowledge of herbs, unmarried women living alone, anyone who didn't fit the mold. In Salem, Massachusetts, spectral evidence, dreams and visions, was admissible in court. When the law legitimizes the irrational, it doesn't just fail to protect, it actively hunts. Yet witch hunts weren't really about witches. They thrived in times of crisis, famine, plague, religious wars, when societies needed scapegoats for their suffering. Germany's Bamberg trials peaked during the 30 Years' War when crops failed and armies ravaged the land. Authorities didn't just tolerate the chaos, they redirected it, offering up witches as sacrifices to public fury. This is the dark alchemy of fear-based law. It transforms anguish into aggression, giving people permission to harm while calling it justice. The echoes today are uncomfortably loud. Modern witch hunts might not involve ducking stools or pyres, but they follow similar patterns. Laws targeting vulnerable groups during upheavals. The Red Scare's blacklists, anti-LGBTQ+ panic laws, even vaccine conspiracy theories that vilify doctors, all tap into that ancient impulse to blame the other when the world feels out of control. The legal veneer makes it respectable, but the mechanism is the same. Perhaps the most unsettling lesson isn't about the past, but about human nature. Every witch trial required ordinary people to participate, neighbors testifying, jurors nodding along, crowds gathering to watch. The law didn't just reflect their fears, it amplified them, turning whispers into verdicts. That's the true warning these trials leave us. When justice becomes a tool for purging undesirables, no one is safe. The fire next time might have your name on its tongue. The train station in Memphis, Tennessee looked perfectly ordinary, neatly painted signs, polished benches, ticket counters with brass fixtures. But if you looked closer, you'd notice the smaller placards tucked between the columns: white waiting room and colored waiting room. This wasn't some rogue conductor's whim, it was the law. From the 1890s to the 1960s, Jim Crow statutes turned racial apartheid into a meticulously coded system, stitching segregation into every stitch of daily life. Drinking fountains, schools, even cemeteries. But here's what chills the blood: these weren't vigilante rules or backroom deals. They were passed by legislatures, enforced by courts, and wrapped in the solemn language of legal precedent. How does injustice wear the mask of legitimacy? The answer lies in the devilish cleverness of these laws, not in their brutality, but in their banality. Take the voting restrictions as Exhibit A. Southern states didn't outright ban black citizens from ballots. They crafted hurdles dressed in neutrality. Literacy tests demanded would-be voters interpret obscure constitutional clauses, while white applicants got asked to recite the alphabet. Poll taxes required payments few sharecroppers could afford, conveniently due months before elections. Grandfather clauses exempted those whose ancestors had voted before 1867, a neat trick, since no black Southerner could meet that bar. Each rule had a plausible veneer, allowing lawmakers to swear they weren't racist, just particular about standards. The cruelty was in the loopholes. Yet Jim Crow's most insidious power wasn't in separating races, it was in defining personhood. A black man might own a thriving pharmacy, but he'd still step off the sidewalk if a white teenager approached. A light-skinned child could be yanked from a whites-only school if someone suspected a drop of black ancestry. These laws didn't just segregate spaces, they policed identity itself, turning bloodlines into crime scenes. When Homer Plessy, a man who could pass for white, purposefully boarded a whites-only train car in 1892, he wasn't just protesting transportation rules. He was forcing America to confront the absurd theater of racial categorization, the Supreme Court's infamous separate but equal ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson didn't just sanction segregation, it certified that the law could manufacture inequality with a straight face. The real shock isn't that Jim Crow existed, it's how deeply ordinary people collaborated with it. Restaurant owners who chose to serve white patrons only weren't radicals, they were protecting their livelihoods under segregation ordinances. Librarians who locked black students out weren't monsters, they were following municipal codes. This is the true horror of institutionalized oppression. It turns participation into a mundane duty, something you do with a shrug rather than a snarl. The banality of evil isn't just a philosopher's phrase. It's the ink on a sheriff's arrest log, the bored tone of a clerk denying a marriage license, but resistance too wore legal disguises. When the NAACP challenged school segregation in Brown v. Board of Education, they didn't just argue inequality, they weaponized sociology, introducing doll tests where black children associated white dolls with goodness. They proved segregation's psychological wound. The victory in 1954 didn't end Jim Crow, but it exposed the lie at its core, that laws claiming neutrality could ever be neutral in an unequal world. The battle wasn't just in courthouses, it was on bridges like Selma's Edmund Pettus, where marchers forced America to choose between its laws and its conscience. Jim Crow's ghost still lingers, not in overt racism, but in systems that achieve similar ends through new means, voter ID laws that disproportionately burden minority communities. School funding tied to property taxes that lock poor districts into neglect. The playbook hasn't changed, just the vocabulary. Those old whites-only signs may be museum pieces now, but the question they posed remains urgent. When does the law protect justice, and when does it merely codify power? The answer isn't in the statutes, but in the silence between them, the space where we decide who gets to be human. The ink on the Nuremberg Laws barely dried before their poison seeped into every corner of German life. Passed in 1935, these weren't just regulations. They were surgical instruments dissecting citizenship along imagined bloodlines. With chilling precision, the Reichstag decreed that Jewish people could no longer be citizens, could not marry non-Jews, could not even fly the national flag. But the true horror lay in the bureaucratic veneer. These laws came with official stamps and parliamentary votes, their cruelty masked by legal jargon. Doctors measured skulls to determine racial purity. Civil servants pored over genealogies to unmask hidden Jews. What made the Nuremberg Laws so devastating wasn't their novelty, it was their banality. They transformed hate into paperwork. Consider the ripple effects of a single clause, the definition of a Mischling, or mixed-race person. First-degree misklings, those with two Jewish grandparents, faced near total exclusion from public life. Second-degree misklings, one Jewish grandparent lived in limbo, allowed to work but branded as biological threats. This wasn't spontaneous violence, it was taxonomy as terror. By codifying identity into tiers, the laws turned neighbors into informants, compelling ordinary Germans to participate in the machinery of exclusion. A teacher checking a child's ancestry papers before allowing them to sit an exam. A nurse denying medicine based on a patient's genealogy. These acts weren't aberrations. They were the system working as designed. The most sinister twist, these laws exploited the very ideals meant to protect society. Germany's Weimar Constitution had guaranteed equality before the law, so the Nazis didn't abolish it. They hollowed it out, redefining equality to mean equal treatment for racially equivalent persons. Judges sworn to uphold justice now presided over its undoing, citing statutes that twisted logic like pretzels. When a Jewish businessman sued after being expelled from his trade union, the Supreme Court ruled against him not because the law permitted discrimination, but because Jews, as aliens, had no right to occupational freedom. The lesson was clear: when legal systems can redefine personhood, no right is safe. Yet the Nuremberg Laws also reveal a paradox about oppression's limits. For all their meticulous cruelty, they failed to achieve their stated goal, a perfectly Judenrein, Jew-free society. Mixed marriages contracted before 1935 remained legal, creating pockets of resistance. Some bureaucrats dragged their feet on enforcement. Others found loopholes to protect colleagues. Even within tyranny, human connections frayed the edges of absolute control. This tension echoes in modern debates about authoritarian regimes where centralized power often stumbles against the stubborn complexity of real lives. The legacy of these laws isn't just a warning about past evils, it's a mirror for present vulnerabilities. When governments today compile registries based on religion or ethnicity, when algorithms sort people into risk categories using opaque criteria, the specter of Nuremberg lingers. Safeguards like judicial review, a free press, and international human rights frameworks exist precisely because law alone is no shield against injustice. It takes more than parchment to protect dignity. It takes people willing to see the humanity behind the headlines. The Nuremberg Laws didn't start with gas chambers, they started with a quiet, relentless belief that some lives matter less. And that's why their story must never fade from memory, not as relic but as reckoning. The dust had barely settled over ground zero when the Patriot Act reshaped the boundaries of American freedom, not with a bang, but with 300 pages of legal fine print. Signed into law just 45 days after 9/11, this sweeping legislation didn't just expand surveillance powers, it rewrote the rulebook on privacy in the name of national security. FBI agents could now access library records without warrants. Financial transactions could be tracked across borders. Sneak and peek, warrants allowed searches without immediate notification. Supporters called it a necessary shield against terror. Critics saw a constitutional house fire. 2 decades later, the debate still simmers. How much liberty must safety consume before it starts to choke on its own feast? What made the Patriot Act so controversial wasn't just its reach, it was the speed and silence with which that reach extended. Buried in its provisions were terms like national security letters, administrative subpoenas that demanded data from tech companies while gagging them from disclosing the requests. Between 2003 and 2006, the FBI issued over 190,000 such letters, often targeting innocent Americans caught in digital dragnets. This was surveillance not as targeted investigation, but as bulk collection, a web so wide it ensnared grandmothers in Omaha alongside suspected radicals. The law's defenders argued that in an age of sleeper cells and encrypted messages, old rules were obsolete, but civil libertarians countered with Benjamin Franklin's warning: those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither. The ripple effects transformed everyday technology into battlegrounds. Apple's refusal in 2016 to unlock an iPhone used by the San Bernardino shooter wasn't just about one device, it was the climax of a silent war between Silicon Valley and the surveillance state. Tech companies, once compliant, now race to encrypt user data end-to-end, knowing the same tools that protected dissidents in authoritarian regimes also shielded criminals closer to home. Meanwhile, programs like PRISM, revealed by Edward Snowden, showed how easily anti-terror laws morphed into mass data harvesting. The Patriot Act had promised to watch only the dangerous, yet somehow it ended up watching everyone. Yet for all its intrusiveness, the law's true legacy might be psychological. Walk through any airport today, and you're stepping into a Patriot Act world full body scanners, no-fly lists, the quiet knowledge that your emails might be flagged for mentioning pressure cookers or backpacks. This normalization is its own kind of erosion, where each small sacrifice of privacy feels inevitable rather than chosen. When Congress reauthorized key provisions in 2020 under the Freedom Act, it wasn't a repeal, just a rebranding, proof that emergency measures have a habit of outlasting emergencies. The tension crystallizes in places like Guantanamo Bay, where enemy combatants languish without trial, a legal black hole the Patriot Act helped dig. Or in the 2017 case of an Oregon landscaper, jailed for refusing to unlock his phone at the border, testing whether the Fifth Amendment protects digital silence. These aren't abstract debates, they're live wires crackling through courtrooms and dinner tables alike. The law's most enduring question isn't about terrorists or spies, it's about us. What will we tolerate in the name of fear? And when the next crisis comes, will we remember that rights surrendered are rarely rights reclaimed? Perhaps the sharpest irony lies in the name itself. A patriot, by definition, loves their country enough to question it. The Act's real test isn't whether it stops attacks, it's whether a society that traded so much of its soul to feel safe can still recognize itself in the mirror. 2 decades on, the verdict isn't in the statutes. It's in the silence of libraries no longer visited, the hesitation before typing a risky search, the uneasy trade we've all learned to make without thinking. The Patriot Act didn't just change laws, it changed what we're willing to lose. The ink was barely dry on the 18th Amendment when America's grand experiment in moral legislation began to unravel. January 17, 1920, the day alcohol officially became illegal across the United States, was meant to usher in a new era of sobriety and virtue. Instead, it opened the floodgates to an underworld of speakeasies, bathtub gin, and Al Capone's bullet-riddled empire. Prohibition wasn't just a failed policy. It was a masterclass in unintended consequences, revealing how laws that reach too deeply into private lives often twist into something darker. The irony, the very legislation designed to purify society became the catalyst for its most spectacular corruption. At first glance, the temperance movement's logic seemed sound. Alcohol was linked to domestic violence, workplace accidents, and poverty. Why not remove the source of the problem? But the Volstead Act's architects made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed banning something would erase the desire for it. Instead, they turned every corner bar into an illicit thrill, every social drinker into a casual criminal. By 1925, New York City alone had over 30,000 speakeasies, more than double the number of legal saloons before Prohibition. The law didn't eliminate drinking, it just handed the industry to gangsters who operated beyond the reach of taxes or regulations. Suddenly, moonshine poisoned thousands, and police precincts became auction houses for confiscated liquor, resold under the table. The cultural whiplash was even more revealing. Prohibition didn't just fail to stop alcohol consumption, it reshaped American social life in ways its proponents never imagined. Women who had been pivotal in the temperance movement now flocked to speakeasies, flouting Victorian norms by drinking and smoking in public. Jazz music thrived in these hidden venues, blending races and classes in ways segregation laws otherwise prevented. The very law meant to enforce morality became the engine of its liberation, proving that human nature resists confinement. When you tell people they can't have something, you don't extinguish the craving, you magnify it. Modern parallels abound. The war on drugs, vaping bans, even debates over sugary drink taxes all grapple with the same dilemma Prohibition laid bare. Can you legislate away temptation? Portugal's decriminalization of all drugs in 2001 offers a striking counterpoint. Rather than fueling chaos, overdose rates plummeted, and addiction began to be treated as a health issue rather than a crime. The lesson isn't that all restrictions are futile. Seat-belt laws save lives without creating black markets, but that laws targeting deeply ingrained personal behaviors require more nuance than brute force. Prohibition's most enduring legacy isn't in its 13-year lifespan, but in the question it forces us to confront. Where does society's right to protect intersect with an individual's right to choose? The 18th Amendment was repealed not because America loved alcohol too much, but because it valued freedom more. Those dusty repeal ballots whisper a warning we do well to remember. Laws written in stone may endure, but only those that respect the fluidity of human nature will ever truly stand the test of time. The abolition of slavery should have been the final chapter, a clean break from centuries of brutality. Yet when the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, declaring that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in America, it carried a devastating loophole, except as punishment for crime. With those 5 words, the legal door remained cracked open, and through it poured a new form of bondage. Southern states wasted no time enacting black codes, laws designed to criminalize poverty and target freedmen for offenses as trivial as vagrancy or unemployment. Suddenly, former slaves found themselves arrested en masse and leased out to plantations, mines, and railroads, their labor coerced once more, this time under the guise of justice. The law had spoken, but the system learned to whisper. This chasm between legal freedom and lived reality reveals a painful truth. Paper proclamations alone can't dismantle deeply rooted oppression. Consider sharecropping contracts that kept black farmers trapped in debt cycles resembling servitude, or convict leasing programs where mortality rates rivaled the worst antebellum plantations. By 1900, Alabama alone derived 73% of its state revenue from leasing prisoners, mostly black men, to private industry. The abolition of slavery wasn't a single event, but a battleground where every inch of progress faced counterattack. The gap persists today in less visible forms. Modern prison labor generates billions annually, with incarcerated workers, disproportionately people of color, paid pennies per hour under threat of solitary confinement. Redlining policies that once barred black families from homeownership created wealth disparities still measurable in 21st century inheritance patterns. Even when laws change, the grooves of inequality run so deep they continue channeling lives like rainwater in worn stone. Yet abolition's unfinished work also offers a blueprint for contemporary movements. Marriage equality activists didn't stop at Obergefell v. Hodges. They pushed for anti-discrimination protections in employment and housing. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation, but it took ongoing lawsuits and protests to desegregate schools decades later. Liberation laws are always beginnings, not endings. They're the first domino, essential but meaningless unless the rest follow. The most vital lesson lies in how resistance adapts. When slavery ended, white supremacists invented Jim Crow. When courts struck that down, mass incarceration emerged. Each time the law closes one door, oppression finds a window. True change requires more than statutes. It demands cultural reckoning, economic repair, and an unrelenting willingness to confront the ways systems reinvent rather than reform. The Abolition Amendment didn't fail. It revealed that justice isn't a signature on parchment, but a daily practice of holding power accountable. The chains may rust, but their shadows stretch long, and only sunlight, relentless and unwavering, can finally fade them. The right to privacy was once as simple as closing your curtains, but in the digital age, it's become a labyrinth with no exit. Every swipe, search, and selfie leaves a breadcrumb trail, harvested by algorithms and traded like currency. Legal systems drafted for paper files and landline calls now stagger under the weight of data breaches, facial recognition, and AI that predicts your thoughts before you voice them. The irony is crushing. The same technologies that connect us globally also strip us bare locally. Europe's GDPR grants citizens control over their data, while in other nations, governments legally purchase location data from prayer apps to track abortion seekers. Privacy laws aren't just lagging, they're fighting yesterday's battles with shields full of holes. Consider the paradox of consent. Clicking "I agree" to a 30,000-word terms of service document isn't choice, it's coercion by exhaustion. Apps manipulate dopamine loops to keep users scrolling, then monetize their attention spans. Meanwhile, courts still debate whether a DNA test kit company can patent your genetic code. The disconnect between innovation and regulation isn't just a gap, it's a chasm, with personal data tumbling into the void. When a single TikTok dance video can reveal your home address through background metadata, the very concept of private life crumbles. Yet the stakes soar higher than individual exposure. China's social credit system scores citizens based on online behavior, while democracies deploy predictive policing algorithms that disproportionately target minority neighborhoods. Both systems share a common foundation: the erosion of privacy as collateral for order. This isn't about hiding wrongdoing, it's about preserving the right to exist unmeasured, unjudged, and unprofiled. The founders of constitutional rights couldn't fathom smartphones, but they understood power's hunger to surveil. The Fourth Amendment's prohibition of unreasonable searches now grapples with thermal imaging, stingray devices, and Amazon Ring cameras, creating de facto police networks. Hope glimmers in unlikely places. Apple's app tracking transparency feature forced companies to ask permission before monitoring users, and over 80% said no. Decentralized Web3 projects promise data ownership through blockchain, though their execution remains messy. Even children's advocacy groups now push for eraser buttons to delete youthful digital footprints. These scattered efforts hint at a future where privacy isn't extinct, just evolving from physical walls to encrypted codes, from whispered secrets to zero-knowledge proofs. The battle won't be won by laws alone, but by culture. Every time someone covers their laptop camera or opts for a privacy-focused search engine, they cast a vote for a world where technology serves humans, not the other way around. The right to privacy isn't vanishing, it's waiting for us to demand it back, one encrypted message at a time. The Amazon rainforest burns while lawmakers debate acres reduced to ash in the time it takes to draft another non-binding resolution. Environmental protection laws represent humanity's most ambitious attempt to negotiate with its own destructive impulses. A promise etched in legal code that will restrain today's greed for tomorrow's survival. Yet here's the painful paradox. While over 150 nations now recognize the right to a healthy environment in their constitutions, carbon emissions hit record highs in 2023. The gap between legal ideals and ecological reality isn't just bureaucratic delay, it's a collision between two irreconcilable clocks, the swift tick of quarterly profits and the slow, deep rhythm of planetary time. Take the landmark Paris Agreement as Exhibit A. Nearly every nation on Earth pledged to limit global warming, then watched as fossil fuel subsidies ballooned to $7 trillion annually. The problem isn't a lack of vision, but enforcement teeth. When Brazil's president vowed to end deforestation, satellite imagery soon revealed clandestine logging surging in protected reserves. Without consequences sharper than sternly worded reports, laws become ecological theater, performances of concern that change no outcomes. The tension sharpens when environmental justice meets economic necessity. Norway's sovereign wealth fund, built on oil profits, now divests from coal to fight climate change, a paradox as glaring as a smoker funding lung cancer research. Developing nations rightly ask why they should throttle their growth when industrialized countries polluted unchecked for centuries. India's solar power boom coexists with new coal mines, encapsulating the global bind. how to balance survival now versus survival later. Corporate loopholes twist the knife further. Carbon offset programs allow airlines to charge passengers extra for green flights while expanding routes paying to plant trees that won't mature for decades as jet engines pump out emissions today. Plastic manufacturers lobby to shift responsibility to consumers through recycling campaigns, despite knowing 91% of plastic isn't recycled. The law's weakness lies in its willingness to accept symbolic victories over systemic change, yet glimmers of hope emerge where local and global align. Costa Rica's Payment for Ecosystem Services program reversed deforestation by paying farmers to preserve trees, turning preservation into a livelihood. The Netherlands' Agenda case forced government emissions cuts through citizen lawsuits, proving courts can break political gridlock. These successes share a common thread. They make sustainability someone's job, not just someone's slogan. The deeper struggle is philosophical. Environmental laws force us to value the invisible clean air we won't miss until it's gone, species that vanish quietly, climate stability we took for granted. Like trying to write a law against gravity, we're legislating the very systems that allow laws to exist. Perhaps that's why these statutes feel so fragile. They're humanity's first fumbling attempts to draft an apology to the future, one we're still learning how to mean. On June 26, 2015, the White House lit up in rainbow colors, not just a celebration, but a beacon signaling how far law can stretch to meet love. The Obergefell v. Hodges ruling didn't just legalize same-sex marriage, it etched into constitutional law what millions already knew in their hearts: that commitment transcends gender. Yet for all its symbolic weight, the decision was less an endpoint than a crossroads where legal recognition collided with deeply rooted resistance. In tiny county clerks' offices across America, some officials resigned rather than sign marriage licenses for gay couples. Churches debated whether to host weddings that contradicted their doctrines. The law had spoken, but the conversation was far from over. What makes marriage equality laws so revealing is how they expose the two-way street between legislation and culture. Denmark became the first country to recognize same-sex unions in 1989, not through judicial decree but gradual public consensus. Politicians followed where voters led. Contrast that with the United States, where courts often outpaced popular opinion. By the time of Obergefell, support for gay marriage had crossed 50% nationally, but pockets of opposition remained entrenched. This disconnect underscores a fascinating dynamic. Laws don't just reflect social change, they accelerate it. Studies show that after legalization, acceptance of same-sex relationships grew faster in states where it was imposed by courts than in those that adopted it legislatively. When the stamp of legality legitimizes something, hearts and minds often follow, sometimes reluctantly but undeniably. Yet the backlash tells its own story. Over 30 U.S. states still lack comprehensive non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ+ individuals, meaning a couple could marry on Saturday and risk losing their jobs or housing on Monday. Countries like Poland and Hungary have rolled back LGBTQ+ rights under family protection banners, proving that legal victories can spark counter-movements. The tension here isn't just about marriage, it's about how much diversity a society is willing to codify. When Taiwan became the first Asian territory to legalize same-sex marriage in 2019, it didn't just change its laws, it challenged an entire region's cultural norms. The ripple effects are still unfolding, with Thailand now considering similar reforms and Singapore reluctantly decriminalizing gay sex while drawing the line at marriage equality. The most poignant battles often play out in the most personal spaces. Consider the couple who sued a bakery for refusing their wedding cake, or the funeral home that denied spousal benefits to a transgender widow. These cases aren't just legal disputes, they're clashes over who gets to define tradition and who must adapt. Religious freedom arguments collide with civil rights claims, leaving courts to balance competing visions of liberty. The irony, many of these tensions were predicted and weaponized during the original debates. Opponents warned of slippery slopes, proponents insisted equality wasn't a zero-sum game. Years later, both sides claim validation, as bakeries win some cases and lose others, and adoption agencies grapple with anti-discrimination statutes. Perhaps the most unexpected lesson from marriage equality laws is how ordinary they've made the extraordinary. In Spain, where same-sex marriage was legalized in 2005, a generation of children has grown up seeing gay parents at school pickups and PTA meetings no more remarkable than left-handedness or freckles. When Ireland voted for marriage equality by popular referendum in 2015, it wasn't just a political shift but a cultural catharsis for a nation once dominated by Catholic dogma. The law's quiet power lies in its ability to render radical love unremarkable, to turn what was once forbidden into something as mundane as grocery shopping. But normalization isn't the same as universal acceptance. From Russia's gay propaganda laws to Ghana's proposed legislation criminalizing LGBTQ+ advocacy, the global picture remains fractured. Even in progressive nations, legal marriage often outpaces social inclusion. Rainbow flags may fly at City Hall, but not necessarily at family reunions. This gap between rights and belonging reveals a deeper truth, that laws can open doors, but they can't force people to walk through them. The stone tablets of justice may be etched with grand proclamations, but the real work happens in living rooms, classrooms, and places of worship, where change is measured not in court orders, but in awkward conversations, reluctant acceptance, and slow dawning understanding. The story of marriage equality laws isn't a tidy arc from oppression to liberation. It's a mosaic of courtroom victories and kitchen table compromises, of constitutional clauses and quiet acts of courage. What began as a fringe demand became a global benchmark for human dignity, not because laws alone changed hearts, but because they gave changed hearts room to breathe. The stones of these laws don't just bear words, they hold the weight of 1 million private hopes, now standing in the light where once they were forced to whisper. Imagine receiving a monthly check from the government, no strings attached, no means testing, just cash to cover basic needs. This isn't science fiction. It's the radical premise behind universal basic income, or UBI, a policy shaking the foundations of welfare systems worldwide. From the frozen villages of Finland to the tech hubs of Silicon Valley, governments and entrepreneurs are running real-world experiments to answer one explosive question: what happens when you give people money without conditions? The Finnish trial in 2017 cut through decades of bureaucratic assumptions. For 2 years, 2,000 unemployed citizens received €560 monthly, no job searches required, no penalties for earning extra income. Critics predicted mass laziness. Instead, participants reported lower stress levels and greater motivation to find work or start businesses. The key: removing the welfare trap, the cruel irony where traditional benefits vanish the moment someone earns a paycheck, leaving them worse off than before. UBI doesn't just alleviate poverty, it restores agency, turning survival from a bureaucratic negotiation into a human right. Yet the fiercest debates rage not over outcomes but philosophy. Conservative opponents argue UBI undermines the dignity of work, while progressive skeptics fear it lets governments off the hook for robust public services. Both miss the tectonic shift beneath their feet. automation is eroding jobs faster than retraining can replace them, from truck drivers displaced by self-driving vehicles to radiologists outperformed by AI diagnostics. When Oxford researchers estimate 47% of U.S. jobs could vanish to automation, UBI stops sounding utopian and starts sounding like a life raft. Even tech titans like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg endorse it, recognizing that capitalist innovation needs consumers with disposable income, even if robots take their paychecks. The most revealing experiments unfold in the global south. Kenya's non-profit-funded UBI program, Give Directly, provides 50 cents a day to villagers, a pittance by Western standards, but enough to transform lives. Recipients invest in livestock, repair roofs, and send children to school instead of mines. Unlike traditional aid, which often dictates how funds should be used and siphons off overhead costs, UBI trusts the poor to know their own needs best. The results: a 12% rise in business startups and a 19% drop in childhood malnutrition. When people aren't scrambling for survival, they make choices that ripple across generations. But UBI's darkest shadow is funding. Alaska's Permanent Fund, which distributes oil revenues to residents annually, offers a glimpse. But scaling this globally would require taxing tech monopolies or implementing wealth taxes that spark fierce resistance. Switzerland's 2016 referendum for a 2,500 franc monthly UBI failed spectacularly, with 77% rejecting it over cost fears. The paradox is biting. Societies balk at the price tag of basic income while quietly paying far more for poverty's collateral damage: emergency room visits, homelessness services, and lost economic potential. Perhaps the most subversive aspect of UBI isn't economic but psychological. By decoupling survival from labor, it challenges the puritanical belief that suffering is virtuous. If a single mother can feed her kids without working 3 jobs, does that make her undeserving? If an artist can create without starving, does that devalue their art? These questions terrify hierarchies built on scarcity. Yet history whispers a counterpoint. When the U.S. nearly passed a basic income bill in 1971, bipartisan support included over 1,000 mayors and Nixon's endorsement. It wasn't killed by cost concerns, but by officials who feared losing control over the poor's choices. The stones of UBI experiments don't just hold dollar amounts, they're mirrors reflecting our deepest biases about who deserves security and who must earn it. As automation accelerates and climate displacement grows, these trials may transition from radical thought experiments to societal necessities. The real test isn't whether we can afford basic income, but whether we can afford to keep pretending the old rules still work. The hospital room is hushed except for the rhythmic beep of machines, a sound that marks time slipping away. In this quiet space, a question hangs heavier than any medical chart. When suffering becomes unbearable, does autonomy extend to choosing how and when life ends? The right to die debate isn't about abstract ethics. It's about real people clutching control in hands that medicine can no longer steady. Countries like Switzerland and Canada have legalized assisted suicide under strict conditions, while others recoil at what they see as a slippery slope toward devaluing vulnerable lives. This 25th law doesn't just challenge our legal framework, it holds a mirror to our deepest fears about mortality, dignity, and who gets to write the final chapter. Consider the case of Brittany Maynard, a 29-year-old with terminal brain cancer who moved to Oregon in 2014 to access its Death with Dignity Act. Her viral video plea, "I don't want to die, but I am dying, and I want to die on my own terms," forced millions to confront uncomfortable questions. If we accept that patients can refuse life-saving treatment, why not grant them the tools to avoid prolonged agony? Yet opposition often comes from unexpected quarters. Some disability rights activists argue that legalizing assisted suicide pressures those with chronic conditions to justify their existence, while religious groups see it as usurping divine authority. The tension isn't just ideological, it's existential. The Netherlands experience reveals both the promise and peril of these laws. Since 2002, Dutch doctors have legally administered lethal drugs to patients meeting stringent criteria, unbearable suffering, voluntary requests, and no reasonable alternatives. But controversies persist. A 2019 case involved a 74-year-old woman with dementia who'd previously requested euthanasia. Footage showed her resisting the fatal injection, raising harrowing questions about consent in cognitive decline. Supporters counter that such outliers don't negate the thousands who have found peaceful release, like the Dutch man with severe autism who won a landmark right to die case in 2021 after arguing his condition caused hopeless and unbearable psychological pain. Legalizing death inevitably reshapes medicine's ethos. Hippocrates' oath traditionally forbade giving a deadly drug to anybody. Yet modern palliative care specialists increasingly view suffering as the enemy, not death itself. In California, some oncology teams now include end-of-life options coordinators alongside radiologists and surgeons, a sign of shifting priorities, but the line between compassion and coercion blurs easily. Japan's growing lonely death industry, where elderly hire strangers to handle their remains, hints at darker societal pressures. When aging populations strain economies, could the right to die quietly become an expectation? The most revealing battles unfold not in legislatures but living rooms. Families watching loved ones fade from ALS or metastasized cancer often split along generational lines, boomers raised on autonomy versus older generations taught to endure. Advanced directives try to bridge this gap, but legal documents can't capture the messy reality of deterioration. A stroke victim who once signed a "do not resuscitate" order might later grasp a grandchild's hand with wordless joy, complicating everything. These intimate struggles expose the heart of the dilemma. Can any law truly account for the fluidity of human will in the face of suffering? What makes this 25th law unique is its irreversibility. Unlike wrongful convictions or flawed policies, death admits no appeals, yet perhaps its greatest lesson isn't about endings, but about what we value in living. The Right to Die movement ultimately asks us to define what makes life worth preserving, not in grand philosophical terms, but in the quiet moments before dawn when pain and meaning hang in precarious balance. These laws don't just change how we die, they challenge how we choose to live. From ancient stone tablets to modern courtrooms, these 25 laws aren't just rules. They're mirrors reflecting humanity's endless struggle to reconcile order with justice, power with compassion. Consider Hammurabi's stele standing tall in Babylon 4,000 years ago, its carved symbols promising that fairness could be measured like grain, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Fast forward to today's Supreme Court justices debating privacy rights in the digital age, and you'll find the same fundamental tension: how to govern ourselves without crushing the very humanity we seek to protect. Each of these laws, whether etched in cuneiform or encoded in algorithms, grapples with a paradox. The draconian codes of Athens sought stability through terror, only to discover that fear alone can't sustain a society. The Magna Carta's barons demanded limits on royal power while denying those same liberties to serfs. Even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that soaring post-war promise of dignity for all, was ratified by nations actively upholding colonial oppression. The pattern is unmistakable. Every leap toward justice reveals new fault lines. Every solution births fresh dilemmas. What makes these laws timeless isn't their perfection, but their honesty. Ashoka's pillars admitted his failures alongside his ideals. Justinian's jurists preserved Roman legal wisdom while quietly editing away inconvenient truths. The best legal systems, like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's Great Law of Peace, built in mechanisms for continuous adaptation, recognizing that rigidity is the enemy of justice. This humility before complexity might be their greatest lesson for our polarized present. Now we stand at another crossroads, facing questions those ancient lawmakers could scarcely imagine. Should algorithms decide criminal sentences? Can environmental rights be enforced against corporations? Does autonomy extend to choosing one's death? These aren't technical challenges, they're spiritual ones, forcing us to decide what kind of civilization we want to become. The stones of the past whisper that laws alone are never enough. They're just the starting point for the harder work of building a world worthy of them. So what do you think? Can we craft rules that uplift rather than control? Share your perspective in the comments, because this conversation, like the laws themselves, is never truly finished. And if you found this journey through humanity's legal conscience as fascinating as we have, hit subscribe to keep exploring history's deepest mysteries together. The next chapter is always